Hey, what's up? And thank you for joining me for another episode of the Roots Podcast. Today, I want to talk about race during the colonial period. Now, this is such a big topic that I think one video won't do it justice, but let's do one now, and I'll try to do another couple in the next couple of weeks. It's a very broad and complicated topic. Definitions changed over time, laws changed over time, but let's use this video to go over some basics. So, first things first, let's cover the four main racial categories that we think of today: European/white, Native American, African, and Asian. So, let's cover the European first, the Spaniard. If you were a Spaniard, whether you were born in Europe or you were born in colonial Mexico or anywhere else in the Americas or anywhere else in the world for that matter, you were an Español no matter what. You were a Spaniard, whether you were born in Europe or the Americas. So that's why when you look at colonial era records, for example, a baptismal record of one of your ancestors, if they were a Spaniard, it would say Español. It wouldn't say Criollo. It wouldn't have Mexican listed in there. It would be Español because again, you were an Español whether you were born in Europe or you were born in colonial Mexico. So, was there a legal distinction between a peninsular, a European Spaniard, or a Criollo, a Mexican Spaniard? Nope. They were both Spaniards. The differences would have been social, not legal distinctions. So if there were any types of, discrimination a Criollo would have faced, it would have been in the social arena, not in the legal arena. So this is why I tell people the vast majority of all Spaniards to ever set foot in Mexico were born in Mexico. They were born in colonial Mexico. At the time of independence, there was only about 15 to 20,000 European Spaniards in Mexico. This is 1810. But there were more than 1 million Spaniards who were born in Mexico. There were more than 1 million criollos. And if you look at their baptismal records or marriage records, all of their records would have listed them as españoles, okay? Spaniards. Now, just because the European Spaniards and the Mexican Spaniards were both Spaniards doesn't mean there wasn't resentment or animosity between the two groups, because clearly there was. That was perhaps the main driver of Mexican independence. Mexican criollos, had resentment against European Spaniards, and that's why the Mexican independence movement and pretty much all of the independence movements across Latin America were organized and driven by, Latin American Spaniards. And contrary to what you might hear around, the social hierarchy in colonial Mexico, yeah, in certain professions there was a hierarchy. People in Mexico City that had bureaucratic jobs, like the tax collectors and stuff like that, those were more likely to be European Spaniards. Of course, no one likes tax collectors, right? But Mexican criollos were some of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the colonial system. Mexico's first president, Guadalupe Victoria, he was a Mexican criollo, and he was a very wealthy landowner. So European Spaniards held lots of political power, specifically in and around Mexico City. But outside of Mexico City, Mexican criollos typically dominated the political and economic scene. Using my family's area around Michoacan as an example, in Zamora, Michoacan, pretty much all the farmland in that area was owned by wealthy criollo families. When you do your genealogy, you'll find out that in many cases, you're a descendant of these wealthy criollo families. But these families, they were the descendants of the first settlers that arrived, in the 1500s, and they received land grants from the King of Spain. And so, over the course of 300 years or so, these families, they intermarried, they bought and sold land to each other. And so essentially, these families became large networks, and functioned as, a loose confederation of family businesses. So the criollos in colonial Mexico held significant political power, at least at the local level. Another example would be, that of Agustin de Iturbide, who, he was the commander of Mexico's independence forces, the Ejército Trigarante. They're the independence force that, liberated Mexico City in 1821. Prior to that, he was the commander of the colonial army, and he was a criollo. And, I think something like 90% or more of the colonial army itself was made up of, people born in Mexico. And most of those people were, or many of them were criollos. Now, let's talk about Native Americans. So this is a very complicated topic because the laws changed, quite dramatically over time, especially, in the beginning. And then also we have to talk about, we have to distinguish between which Native groups we are talking about, because, certain Native groups had many rights and privileges, while other Native groups had no rights at all, or effectively no rights at all. So, there's some big distinctions that need to be made. So let's go over a few laws that had a huge impact on the lives of indigenous people during this colonization process. We hear a lot about the abuses that occurred as a result of policies carried out by Christopher Columbus during the colonization of the Caribbean, in the years after 1492. In this early period, there weren't enough references in Spanish laws, to address how to exist alongside Native people. So there were a lot of abuses in the early period, this period right after 1492. So it wasn't until the year 1500 that we start to see some real movement with regard to, rights for indigenous people. It was in the year 1500 that Queen Isabel of Castilla recognized indigenous people as subjects of the Spanish monarchy. Now, this word subject, the Spaniards were also subjects of the Spanish monarchy. Anybody who was, loyal to the Spanish monarchy within the Spanish Empire was defined as a subject. This is why we use the term, loyal subjects, when we think about like medieval times. Well, this is how citizenship was defined back then. This is the terminology that they used. So it was in that year that, the Spanish monarchy recognized indigenous people as subjects of the Spanish monarchy. And this opened the door to, rights to be granted to indigenous people. Now, it was in 1512 that the Spanish monarchy finally addressed the issue of slavery with regard to Native Americans. This is when they passed the laws of Burgos. Burgos is a province in Spain. So the laws of Burgos outlawed the enslavement of indigenous people who were Catholic and loyal to the Spanish monarchy. This dual loyalty, loyalty to Catholicism and loyalty to the state, this was the hallmark of Spanish citizenship. In order to be a citizen within the Spanish Empire, you needed to be loyal to those two things. Mexico also had similar laws after it became independent. In order to be a Mexican citizen or to be granted Mexican citizenship, you had to be Catholic in Mexico up until about 1860. So Mexico had, essentially the same laws with this respect. Spaniards were also held to a similar standard. If you were Spaniard, if you were not Catholic, you could be expelled from the Spanish Empire, which is what happened to, Spanish Muslims and Spanish, Sephardic Jews. They were expelled from the Spanish Empire. So if you were Spanish and you were not Catholic, you also couldn't be a citizen. And also too, you had to be loyal to the monarchy. That was just a fundamental part of Spanish citizenship. Laws like this exist in modern times. For example, when you become a citizen of the United States, through naturalization, you have to swear an oath that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So every country in the world has some sort of expectations based around loyalty to the system. And then in 1542, the Spanish Empire further expanded human rights for indigenous people when they passed the new laws, las leyes nuevas. These laws outlawed the enslavement of all indigenous people across the board, even for non Catholics and for those whose loyalty was in question. Now, were there still some incidences of indigenous people being illegally trafficked for slavery? Yes, but now there was a framework for prosecuting people that violated those laws. And there are clear examples of people being arrested and punished, thrown in jail for illegally enslaving indigenous people. I mean, illegal slavery still exists in the world, but it's thanks to these early innovations that we have a framework from which to work with so that people can be punished. Now, by this time, 1542, the 1540s, much of Mexico, what we know of as Mexico today, wasn't fully conquered. The Spaniards had barely had a foothold in central Mexico. Like the coast of Veracruz, Tlaxcala, the portions that were once the Aztec Empire, and then, the area around Jalisco. So the issue of slavery was addressed before the Spanish Empire expanded beyond that area. So the granting of rights to indigenous people occurred very early on in the colonization process. So I'm going to go ahead and end the discussion right there. I think we've covered a lot today, but thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you all again next week.